Alright, welcome to week 3. This week we have a new book. It is Writing Women's Literary History by Margaret J.M. Ezell, older, from the 90s, older than me. It is also way more practical than Living a Feminist Life. I like that book, I just don't really like theory. This book is far more practical, and I would say interesting for me. This one is a lot about women's authorship and the way we study women in authorship, particularly older than what I'm studying, so like 19 and not beyond, opposite direction, behind. I don't make any sense, I'm so sorry. But what I find most useful from this book so far is her discussion of what works are added to the women's literary canon, and how a lot of that has to do with 19th century romantic ideals of authorship and publishing, and how, you know, pre-18th century publishing wasn't really the goal for a lot of female authors, and so as a result they get left out of the canon. And also the kind of genealogies of the way we write literary history tends to disregard them because of all these 19th century ideas. So good book so far, I like it. And a lot of the articles I read this week too, kind of going more into kind of the beginnings of feminist bibliography, and by the beginnings I mean the oldest article I read on it was from 2008. So talks a lot about the same idea of how women's literary history or book history before kind of the 90s was all about pointing out exceptions to the rule and not challenging why those women were exceptions, or investigating why, and a lot of just basically what she says in this book about how we project ideas from the 19th century onto all other time periods without any regard. And I love the 19th century, but maybe we shouldn't do that. Boring part over, fun part begins. What I was reading, I did finish Dragonflight, the first book in the Dragon Riders of Pern series. Now the first half was a little slow. The first half didn't quite hook me. The end, very fast paced, very, very me. It's like McCaffery time traveled to now, went into my brain and said, I'm gonna write a book about time traveling dinosaur dragons that's also kind of feminist, and she wrote Dragonflight. You had me with dinosaur dragons, you had me even more with time traveling dinosaur dragons, let's be for real. And a commentary on this book, if you will, is that this book has racially ambiguous characters, which is to say it's implied, and I think later canonized in other books, that these people are descendants of colonizers from Earth 2,000 years ago, and the original colonizers were of multiracial, and so all the people kind of living now are ethnically ambiguous, quote unquote, and a descendant of all of these different races that settled this planet. And so that's obviously just not really depicted on a lot of cover art until, nowadays, because we all know that story. That's another story. It's honestly going to be part of my research. But it made me think about something that one of my favorite media commentators, Princess Weeks, here on YouTube, talked about in a video about diversity, and I think Game of Thrones. I've never read Game of Thrones, I've never read any of George R. R. Martin's work, I have no interest in it. There's simply, there's 23 books in the Dragon Riders of Pern series I need to get through. George R. R. Martin is not on my radar. And talking about how, kind of retcon diversity into these projects in terms of also Lord of the Rings, and instead of adapting like fantasy and sci-fi classics that already have diversity built into them. It's like the Dragon Riders of Pern exists. It's a multi-book series that's critically acclaimed, and it has a diversity and time-traveling dragons. But we're gonna like go back and readapt Lord of the Rings like 10 trillion times, even though he was racist. No, he was racist, and just retcon diversity into it. It just doesn't make any sense. In that video, she actually mentioned too the Tortal universe, which is the same thing, where it's like almost entirely, well, it's not entirely, it includes a large amount of diversity that just increases as the series goes on. Also like 20 books, also genius, but we could be adapting that. Like, we really could. Like, the material is there. Not that I want to see an adaptation of the Tortal universe, like, I don't want it to be butchered like that, but it just makes you think. It makes you think. That's what I was thinking about while I was reading this book. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.